Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
Welcome back to Outlaws and Gunslingers Mafia Edition. Coming back with sort of a doubleheader, but one and the same. We got two conferences. I know last week on the commission episode we said we'd get into the Genovese crime family, but then forgot about these that took place before the Frank Costello took over the Genovese crime family, which is where we're going to start with those guys. So we'll do these real quick, which is the Atlantic City Conference held in 1929 and the Havana Conference held in the 40s. Yeah, two big conferences, and the first one being the Atlantic City Conference held between May 13th through the 16th in 1929. It was a summit of leaders, obviously, of the mafia. It is considered by most crime historians to be the earliest organized crime summit held in the United States. Early May of 1929, Meyer Lansky was married, and he and his closest underworld friends concluded the resort town of Atlantic City, New Jersey would be an ideal place to have both a honeymoon and also a conference, allowing Lansky to mix pleasure and business along with the rest of the bosses. This conference could be considered the first concrete move towards establishing the national crime syndicate that eventually controlled all major criminal activities in America.
Really? Well, this Atlantic City Conference was said to be hosted by Meyer Lansky himself, Italian-American mobster Johnny Torrio, also Lucky Luciano was there, and I know Frank Costello, which we'll be doing an episode on him. The organizing host of the conference was Atlantic City and South Jersey crime boss Enoch Nucky Johnson.
Nucky Johnson, who we did an episode on way back when we were doing Prohibition, so go check him out.
He was like, dude, I can provide hotel accommodations, food, and entertainment for all while making a guarantee of no police interference, which was true.
I mean, he owned the damn town.
Right. The largest delegation in the conference came from the New York, New Jersey area and included mobsters Johnny the Fox Torrio, formerly of Chicago, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Giuseppe Dodo, they call him Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese, all top members of the Manhattan's powerful Mazzaria family. Albert the Mad Hatter, Anastasia, Frank Scalise, they call him Cheech, from the D'Aquila and Mineo family of Manhattan. And then you got Gaetano Lucchese, which is represented the Reina family of out of Bronx. Then you had Corico Moretti. He represented the Mazzaria family's Newark, New Jersey. Look at that.
And then we also had Meyer the Brain Lansky plus Benny Bugsy Siegel, who were bosses of the Bugs and Meyer mob. They protected the liquor shipments in the New York, New Jersey areas. We had Louis Lepke Buckhalter, Jacob Gura Shapiro, which they were considered the underworld's Rockefellers. So look at these guys. Got the money, huh?
Oh, shit.
And also known as the Gorilla Boys.
Nice.
Also had Abner Longy Zwillman, also representing the Newark, New Jersey. Dutch Schultz, Bronx Bear Baron, and Harlem Numbers King. Owen Oni the Killer Madden, which was boss of the Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen and the Irish Combine. We had Frank Erickson, who was former Rothstein lieutenant, Costello associate, and future bookmaking kingpin. Dude, we're going to cover all these freaking guys.
Right.
Dude.
It's going to be great.
Chicago was represented by the one and only Scarface, Al Capone himself. Plus, he had Frank the Enforcer Nitty, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Frank Klein Rio. Why?
Right.
Which was top members of the Southside Capone gang and represented Midwest interests, Capone bodyguard, and only one of two Irish gangsters present, Frank McErling
Nice.
of the Southside Salties / McErling gang.
Fantastic.
Everybody there, dude.
Well, from Philly came top Jewish American bosses Irving Waxy Gordon Wexler, Harry Nig Rosen Stromberg, Max Boo Boo Huff,
Hey, boo-boo.
Irving Bitsy Bits, and Charles Schwartz. He don't get a nickname.
They're all Jews.
From Cleveland came the Little Jewish Navy of Morris Mo Dalitz and Lois Lurati Rothkopf, along with adopted Polizzi family member Leo Charles Polizzi. Actually, his last name was Berkowitz.
Hey, wasn't Summer Sam, son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz?
I think so.
Ooh.
Berkowitz represented Little Italy's Mayfield Road mob. Cool. The feared Purple Gang of Detroit was represented by A. Bernstein. Bernstein, what's that, like Polish? German?
Jewish.
Yeah, Stein, obviously.
Right.
Stein. A. Bernstein and his brother Joseph Bugs Bill Bernstein. Boston's most prominent bootlegger, Charles King Solomon, was present as well, while Kansas City's Bellstrier Gang and the Pendergast Machine were represented by the boss, John Lazia.
Jeez, dude. Delegations from Florida and Louisiana were also present at this time, which would most likely be Luciano and Costello allies Santo Traficante Sr. of Tampa, plus Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carolla of New Orleans.
Nice.
Two of the underworld's most powerful leaders, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano of New York, were not invited.
Of course they weren't.
The Old Guard, or the quote-unquote Mustache Pete's, which we've heard, maintained traditional Old World ideals and business practices that restricted them from working with other ethnic gangs outside of the Italian underworld,
Right.
which we see there's a bunch of Jews here.
Right.
This was counter to the ideals and principles that the leaders such as Luciano and Torrio wished to express to the other delegates in Atlantic City. At the time of the conference, future underworld power Joe Bananas Bonanno was Maranzano's top lieutenant and aide and was not invited either, though he would soon become one of the architects of the National Crime Syndicate and the La Cosa Nostra Commission. Yeah, he had to stick
obviously,
you've heard.
He had to stick with Maranzano for that time, but he was
Right.
He was in line with Luciano.
If you guys heard the Castellamarese War, you know everybody turned on Maranzano, so.
Because they're like, dude, enough is enough, and it's time for a change.
We need to progress.
Right, and then they found out, oh wait, maybe we do only need Italians.
Right.
The conference started off with an apparent embarrassing incident for some of those invited who tried to check into the first hotel Nucky Johnson had them registered to, namely at the exclusive Atlantic City Breakers Hotel along the boardwalk, which then was restricted to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants clients.
Oh, so they wouldn't let none of these dirty Italians and Jews in, huh?
Right. In the later years, the Breakers Hotel catered to mainly Jewish clientele, becoming known as the aristocrat of kosher hotels.
Okay.
Once the hotel's management found out multiple guests were trying to check in with Anglo-Saxon aliases, some delegates refused admittance. Subsequently, Nucky heard about the problem and rushed over to the hotel to mitigate the situation. He's like, what are you doing?
Al Capone, being himself, screamed at Nucky Johnson for not making the proper arrangements, and a loud argument ensued between the two gangsters while the others watched and hoped they would not come to blows. Some of them were like, yes, go to blows.
Right.
Suddenly, Johnson, who was taller and heavier than Capone, pushed him into a limousine and ordered everyone to follow him. They headed for the Ritz-Carlton and Ambassador hotels, and when Capone reached the hotel, he ripped several framed paintings and photos off the walls of the hotel and started to throw them at Nucky. Jeez, the others concentrated on keeping Al Capone calm and quiet for the time being.
Oh,
they don't want to unleash Al.
You ain't kidding.
Holy shit.
For the first 3 days, there were a constant round of parties at the hotels, with Nucky supplying plenty of liquor, food, girls, and any type of entertainment you can think of.
This is in 29, so
Right.
4 years before Prohibition ends. So,
Right.
Yeah, dude.
For the guests who brought their wives or girlfriends, Johnson provided the women with fur capes as gifts.
Damn.
Meyer Lansky, who was the new bridegroom and guest of honor, received the presidential suite at the Ritz Hotel with a constant supply of champagne for him and his wife, Anna.
Oh.
And then they also had like little events planned for Anna, so
They can go do their business. I'm sure all the women had hair appointments and
Right.
shit like that.
there were several important items to discuss among the attendees, such as constant competition for imported and bootlegged liquor, the profits among the gangs, what they're going to do about that, what to do about the liquor business if or when Prohibition ends, greater investment in gambling operations, and what to do about the Chicago violence problem. Hey, bud.
Hey, guess about 100 years later and nobody knows what to do about that.
They're
so.
still trying to figure that shit out.
The Atlantic City delegates conducted their more serious discussions and business privately in conference rooms atop the Ritz and Ambassador hotels. Not all the meetings were held in a room around a long table. Some discussions were held out in the open.
Might as well.
With the delegates taking their socks off and rolling up their pants for walks along the beach, on the sand, and in the open air.
Might as well.
Good for them. This made the conference no great secret, with local newspapers carrying photos of Al Capone and some of the other prominent delegates as they cruised down the Jersey Shore boardwalk and beaches, dipping their feet into the water.
Fantastic. Well, look at that.
I mean, hey, what they can do? They're celebrating Meyer Lansky's wedding. That's their excuse.
All right. Well, very important decisions were made to stop competing with each other during the remainder of Prohibition and cooperate in pooling their resources to maximize profits.
Keep in mind, this is before the commission,
Right.
and this is before the five families are formed, so
Right.
they don't have no structure right now.
Right. So they wanted to work together so they can pool their resources to maximize profits and develop a national monopoly in the illegal liquor business. They had to know it was going to end sooner or later.
I mean, it's still 4 years out.
One of the most important discussions was what to do when Prohibition ended. The bosses decided to reorganize themselves and their gangs into cooperative organizations, investing in legitimate breweries, distilleries, and liquor importation franchises. Like, we just can't leave the alcohol industry. We got to at least try to take over the breweries and stuff. By making investments in the legitimate liquor business and by owning nightclubs, bars, and restaurants to distribute the liquor and maximize profits. And this gave the syndicate some security against the repeal of prohibition.
Yeah. The delegates held discussions about taking a larger interest in illegal and cooperative gambling activities such as bookmaking, horse racing, and casinos. The New York and Chicago representatives laid out a plan to tie in the National Wire Service for horse racing bettors with the Daily Race Inform, a tabloid newspaper. Yeah, so probably does like tips on bets and who's popular coming up.
Right.
And to lay off bets throughout the United States. This idea was introduced to the conference delegates after Capone ran into Chicago's Moses Annenberg, who controlled the mob that enforced distribution of William Hearst's newspapers in the Chicago area.
Fantastic.
William Hearst, huh? The families in New York and Chicago would oversee and direct operations for this cooperative and very lucrative venture. Yeah, bet it would be. William Hearst? Dude, he founded like every newspaper.
Everything. Ridiculous. Well, New York bosses Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky were chosen as directors to coordinate the operations along with Chicago representatives. New York's future layoff king and gambling czar, Frank Erickson, was chosen to oversee the organization of the operation along with Chicago's Moses Annenberg.
Okay.
Chicago businessman and underworld associate Moses Annenberg was not originally invited to the conference, but after running into Al Capone, the well-known Annenberg was most likely invited to confer with the leaders on business matters concerning the National Race Wire.
Right. He's like, oh, shit. Right. You should come to this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they don't know much about you, but trust me, man, you can come.
Hey, this is a friend of mine.
Don't worry. If Nucky has a problem, I'll throw some paintings at him.
Throw some paintings right at him. I just imagine him, how they do in like the cartoons or whatever, bust him over his head. Good stuff. It was agreed by the conference delegates that investments into the legitimate liquor business and gambling was the way to offset the loss of profits from the end of prohibition, and discussions to divide the country into exclusive franchises territories for the bosses and their gangs were started at this conference.
Damn right.
Another important topic was the ongoing violence and bloodletting that was occurring in Chicago. The underworld wars in Chicago and to some extent New York had brought about a public and media outcry on law enforcement to stop the violence.
I mean, everybody's so they remember like the gangs in New York and all that. That's where all the five families are from. But Midwest crime, dude, back in these days were just insane and brutal. Ridiculous.
Crazy.
There had been added media and law enforcement attention, and this was placing pressure on underworld rackets and operations around the country. Most of the pressure was due to the recent St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago.
Yeah.
With former Al Capone boss and mentor Johnny Torrio taking the lead and Charlie Lucky Luciano and the other delegates backing him up. Capone, he was chosen as a sacrificial lamb to ease the heat brought on the underworld and its leaders. Capone was convinced after much debate to allow himself to be arrested on a minor charge and sent to prison for a short period of time, deflecting the media and law enforcement pressure for the good of the whole underworld. They're like, are you sure, bud? Like, dude, you got it.
Okay. After the conference concluded, Al Capone and his bodyguard Frank Rio went to Philadelphia, where two friendly cops arrested and charged them with carrying a gun. Capone and Rio were sentenced to a year in prison, but were released back in Chicago after several months.
Fantastic.
Before the end of the conference, though, emphasis was laid on the fact that all the future plans and operations had to be appropriated and administered peacefully among the country's bosses and organizations, avoiding the sort of violent conflicts that had plagued the underworld in the past.
Right.
The highly successful Big Seven group was used as a model of future organization and peace for the new national syndicate.
I mean, you got to have some. I mean, come on. Look at the government.
Got to have some structure, man.
Right. It's the only way it works. New York bosses Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano were two old guard mafiosis who held a lot of power and influence nationally and could not be taken lightly. Plus, they had a lot of people back in the old country.
Sicily, especially Maranzano.
The two major underworld powers were ready to square off in a war.
Well, they're going to.
Which was seen as running counter to the organizational plans for the future of Atlantic City delegates had agreed upon.
Right, they're over here at this Atlantic City conference talking about Chicago. You guys need to cool it down. Right. Meanwhile, these two are about to start the fucking Castellammarese war here.
Oh, man. Jeez. The leaders that attended the conference all agreed that to continue with the syndicate's future plans, the old guard or the mustache Pete's would have to be eliminated eventually. Sooner or later, we got to get rid of these guys.
Sooner or later, man.
It was understood that New York's Charlie Luciano and Meyer Lansky group, along with their alliance of up-and-coming Young Turks, would have to deal with the old line bosses once the time was right. That's why he let the Young Turks do it.
Yeah, well, this led to Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky to disband the Bugs and Meyer mob group. What are they, freaking lawyers? And found their Murder Inc. organization several years later, where they worked for Luciano's hitmen.
Right.
Before Siegel moved to California in the late 30s, the organization was passed on to Albert Anastasia and Louis Buckhalter.
Nice.
Meanwhile, the new National Alliance or Syndicate in Detroit, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere would back up the New York forces through removal of the old guard in their areas if need be.
Which would be a little bit easier than New York.
Right. It was clear to the delegates at the Atlantic City Conference that Lucky Luciano was a leader who commanded great respect and would eventually become the first among equals in the syndicate.
Well, some historians believe that representation at the conference was not representative of the ethnic makeup of the U.S. criminal element, being that the delegation consisted of mostly Italian and Jewish crime leaders. Because of the lack of substantial Irish delegation, a conclusion was made that this could have been the beginning of underworld domination by Italian and Jewish crime groups.
No shit.
The Irish still possessed an influential presence in America's criminal and political worlds.
Dude, the Boston mob.
And had a number of dominant crime leaders in New York, Boston, and Philly.
Right.
Mostly Philly and Boston.
Right.
They had a little part in New York.
The most prominent and well-known Irish bosses of the time included Frank Wallace of Boston, Danny Walsh of Providence. Providence, Rhode Island, dude, that's a big one.
Right.
George Bugs Moran, who was the South Side in Chicago that Capone was beefing with. Plus, you had brothers who are called the Southside O'Donnells, which consisted of Spike, Stephen, Tommy, and Walter.
Oh.
We had the West Side O'Donnells, which had Klondike and Miles.
Oh, jeez.
Were they like an offshoot of each other? We had William Big Bill Dwyer, which we did an episode on, Prohibition guy. He was a big guy. Charles Vanny Higgins, Jack Legs Diamond, and Vincent Mad Dog Call of New York. They're all Irish, huh? Walsh was one of the leaders that many crime historians are unsure attended the meeting. He was one of the most prominent Irish bootleggers of the Prohibition era, was an associate and partner of New York's Irish Combine leaders, Dwyer and Madden, and was an alleged member of the Big Seven group as well, so I'm sure he was there. Why wouldn't he have been?
Of course. This alone should have guaranteed his invitation, but some crime historians point to the fact that only 2 other Irish bosses were confirmed to be present at the meeting. Walsh's membership in the Big Seven group and the fact that he was not killed until 1933 makes for a good argument to include him.
All right, we'll include him. You were there, Walsh.
But had he been present, he would have been only one of 3 Irish bosses in attendance.
Okay. Irish wishwash.
Right.
Irish bosses.
Some crime historians,
Such as Bang and Dang.
right, and also T.J. English, believe that the Italian and Jewish crime bosses did not invite the most prominent Irish bootleggers and criminals of the time to the Atlantic City Conference because they intended to marginalize them along with the old guard from Mustache Pete's that controlled the majority of criminal operations in the big cities. They're like, we need to control these Mustache Pete's and these Irish.
Well, you can think about it. The Irish probably are more settled into the gangs than them because they've been around since the 1800s.
Yeah, they're going to be like the Mustache Pete's.
Right. Yeah, makes
Which
sense.
the Irish are still kind of like that today.
Some other historians believe English is correct, which is T.J. English, the historian. They say that Italians and Jews wanted to marginalize the Irish bosses and so did not invite them. Historians of organized crime note that the motivations were not out of some ethnic racial hatred, and nor was it out of sheer greed. The Irish had begun a type of criminal assimilation, leaving behind violent street rackets and moving on to more sophisticated types of organized illegality, such as taking over and corrupting the police force and local government of large cities.
Obviously.
As author T.J. English writes, he says, in later years, when Luciano or Lansky would ask, what about the Irish? Who's taking care of the Irish? They didn't mean Irish mobsters. They meant the Irish cops, politicians, and establishment figures who were, quote-unquote, friendly.
Right.
Yeah, the Irish knew what they were doing, man. They infiltrated the highest level of shit.
They did. They did. In the eyes of many Italian Jewish gangsters, there was the fair and proper role for the Irish in the underworld, since they had gotten here first, so to speak.
What did I just say?
And had infiltrated the upper world. That was their function.
Yep, we'll leave the Irish to be the captains and the politicians and all these guys, and we'll just be friendly with them.
Right. The rest should be left to the Italians, Jews, and even the blacks.
Even the blacks.
Well,
Good for them,
sometimes they
including them.
They let them come in later on.
Right.
Perhaps owing to this theory, Frank Wallace was killed by hitters in Boston's Italian mob in 1931, and Danny Walsh disappeared in 1933. Whether or not there was a concerted plan to exclude them because of their ethnicity, several prominent Irish mob bosses were left out of the conference, as we said before. Also, they did this because they were currently engaged in full-scale gang warfare with rival Italian and Jewish bosses.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense.
Right. Meanwhile, Bugs Moran would have been the Irish boss to represent Chicago, despite any plan to marginalize Irish mobsters.
That's like Zelensky getting married and inviting Putin.
Right, right. Bugs Moran would have been the Irish boss to represent Chicago, but he had just missed being killed in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and he faded into obscurity soon after. Southside and Westside O'Donnells of Chicago weren't as powerful as him, and would not have been chosen to represent Chicago anyway, as they were at war with Capone and his allies. New York's Vannie Higgins, Legs Diamond, and Vincent Call might have been invited, but were involved in the Manhattan beer wars against Jewish bosses Dutch Schultz, Waxy Gordon, and Welsh boss Oni Madden. Yeah, so they're not coming. Like, screw all these guys.
Yep. Very, 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 very true. At the Atlantic City Conference, Schultz was heard saying at the Ambassador Hotel, "This crazy maniac Call is causing me no end of grief." And then Gordon added, "Yeah, and what about this bastard Legs Diamond? He's hijacking my trucks, raiding our clip joints all over North Jersey." Vannie Higgins was killed on the 19th of January 1932 in New York. Legs Diamond was shot 3 times and killed in his Albany, New York hideout on the 18th of December 1931. Mad Dog Call was killed inside a New York phone booth by Schultz's gunmen while talking to Oni Madden on the 8th of February.
Oni Madden set that shit up.
1932.
Yeah. Wow. Of note is the face of Irish mob boss Bill Dwyer. He was not killed, nor was he forced out of the rackets by any other gangster, Italian or otherwise.
Yeah, but we all know what happened to him.
Under his own volition, he retired from organized crime towards the end of Prohibition and settled into life with his wife and 5 children in Belle Harbor, Queens. He died there in 1946 at the age of 63 after suffering a heart attack.
All right.
One Jewish criminal killed following the conference was Jewish mob boss and Boston's most prominent crime leader and bootlegger Charles King Solomon, as he was killed at his Roxbury Boston speakeasy, known as the Cotton Club, on January 24th, 1933. They're eliminating all these guys, dude.
Law enforcement theorized that either Italian or Irish underworld leaders in North End Bucola family of Boston, Massachusetts, or the Walsh mob of Providence, Rhode Island, had Solomon assassinated. Either way, Solomon became another victim of the mob war for dominance in New England's underworld in the midst of the area's prohibition wars. Just another victim, man.
What do they say? Another statistic.
Right. And others. As Irish bosses, Wallace and most likely Walsh, were killed by Boston's North End Italians, Solomon was most likely killed by them as well. Being that Italian dominance was uncontested in the New England underworld thereafter, other than in South Boston, which was too heavily populated by the Irish.
You ain't taking control of the Southeast. And that was the Atlantic City.
What was that movie? The Italian Job? Wasn't that about the Irish?
I don't know.
I don't know why they call it the Italian Job.
I don't know. It was like a bank job or something, wasn't it? I don't know.
Was it?
What was it, like with Mark Wahlberg?
Yeah, I thought it had to do with the mob.
I don't know.
I never watched it.
That was the Atlantic City Conference, which kind of set up the end of the big-time Irish guys.
It seemed like it was a productive meeting, man. All those people around getting on the same page.
Got on the same page, and most likely led to the decision to take out Maranzano and Masseria later on.
Definitely.
Which leads us to the end of Lucky's reign, near the end of his reign, the Havana Conference, probably more famous than the Atlantic City one,
right,
which happened in 1946. In Havana, Cuba, supposedly arranged by Lucky Luciano, the conference was held to discuss important mob policies, rules, and business interests. Took place
because Lucky couldn't go to the United States.
Yep, he was already deported by now. The conference took place at the Hotel Nacional de Cuba. The reported organizer of the conference was crime boss Lucky. At the beginning of World War II, he was serving a 30 to 50-year prison term for pandering. In 1942, we already know this, U.S. military intelligence officers approached Joseph Sox Lanza and Meyer Lansky with a proposal for Luciano. At the time, Lanza was one of the mafia bosses who controlled Manhattan's Fulton Fish Market, its workers, and the docks in lower Manhattan, and Lansky had broader power in cities along the Atlantic seaboard. Like, dude, we need your help with these Nazis, dude.
We need your help. Military intelligence was worried about possible Nazi sabotage of docks and other shipping facilities in New York and other East Coast ports. The government told Luciano that if his family was able to protect East Coast ports from sabotage, he would be pardoned at the end of the war and deported to Italy as a free man. Luciano agreed, and he was like, "I will assist you, government." After the end of the war, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey agreed to Luciano's pardon on the condition that he never be allowed back in the United States ever again. February 1946. After a lavish farewell party on an ocean liner, Luciano sailed back to Italy. He first settled in Lucara Fritti, and that's in Sicily, then moved to Palermo, Naples, and then Rome.
Wow.
After being forced out of Rome by Italian police, he finally settled in Naples and immediately started planning a return to the United States.
Of course he did.
Right, he's like, man, Italy ain't as great as they say it was.
Like, we need to go over there. Plus, I'm sure those old guys, those old heads are still over there, dude. So
he couldn't do nothing.
No. Early fall 1946, he received a sealed envelope from a recently deported U.S. mafioso, which contained 3 words: December, Hotel Nacional. I don't know how to say that in Spanish, guys. Sorry. And later, September, Luciano obtained 2 Italian passports issued in his real name, Salvatore Lucania.
Nice.
With visas for Mexico, Cuba, and several South American nations.
Of course.
He was now able to visit the Western Hemisphere and meet with criminal associates from the U.S.
Right. Obviously.
You think they would have banned all that, too? Yeah. I guess not Mexico and Cuba, but well, not even South America.
Or Puerto Rico.
Right.
Not yet.
No.
In late October, Luciano traveled from Italy to Caracas, Venezuela. He went to Mexico City and then finally Havana, Cuba. Lansky greeted his old friend on his arrival in Cuba. Following Luciano's orders, Lansky had organized a conference in Havana the week of December 22nd. He did that with crime bosses from all over the United States. Meyer Lansky quickly suggested that Lucky purchase a $150,000 interest in the Hotel Nacional, a plush casino and hotel owned by Lansky and his silent partner, Cuban President Fulgencio Batista y Salvador. Luciano was like, hell yeah! And then the Havana Conference was set.
The silent partner is the president of Cuba.
Again, why not?
1946, December, the Havana Conference started as planned. To welcome Luciano back from exile and acknowledge his continued authority within the mob, all the conference invitees brought Luciano cash envelopes. Nice. Was he getting married? These Christmas presents, quote unquote, totaled more than $200,000.
Jeez.
At the first night dinner hosted by Lansky, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis, Luciano was presented with the money. The official cover story for the Havana Conference was that mobsters were attending a gala party with Frank Sinatra. Yeah, Frank Sinatra was at this damn thing.
Frank Sinatra had his hands all in this shit.
Of course. He was supposedly the entertainment. Sinatra flew to Havana with Al Capone cousins, Charlie Rocco and Joseph Fischetti from Chicago. Joe Fischetti, an old Sinatra acquaintance, acted as Sinatra's chaperone and bodyguard. Charlie and Rocco Fischetti delivered a suitcase containing $2 million to Luciano. Damn, which was his share of the U.S. rackets he still controlled. Holy shit, dude.
Luciano's like, dude, I love being exiled from the United States.
Well, he's like, that's why I want to go back to the United States.
The most pressing items on the conference agenda were the leadership and authority within New York Mafia. The mob
Shit's breaking down right now.
Right. The mob controlled Havana casino interests, the narcotics operations, and the West Coast operations of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel.
Yeah.
Especially the new Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Vegas.
This is what seals old Bugsy's fate, man.
Yeah, poor guy. Lucky, absent from American underworld scene for several months, was especially concerned with the situation in New York. He's like, man, I'm pretty concerned with the situation in New York. He's like, boss Vito Genovese had returned to New York from exile in Italy and was not content with assuming a minor role in an organization. He was like, dude, I will not.
He was not, because at this time, Costello's the leading guy since Luciano's been gone. And Genovese's like, no, man.
He's like, no, wait a minute here. I have not taken orders for years.
If you want to get technical.
I'm not going to start now.
When Luciano, we'll get to this next episode, but when Luciano had to get deported, Genovese was actually the guy who took over for a couple months until he was indicted for murder, and then he fled.
Right.
So.
Really?
So a whole bunch of just power struggling and...
Right. Really, Luciano was still behind the scenes.
Well, he was the official boss.
Right.
Right.
So you had 3 different guys wanting to do stuff. I mean, it's rough.
Can't have that. The Havana Conference convened on December 20th, 1946. Delegates were present representing New York, New Jersey, Buffalo, Chicago, New Orleans, and Florida. What? That's right. The largest delegation of bosses was obviously from the New York, New Jersey area. Several major bosses from the Jewish syndicate were at the conference to discuss joint La Cosa Nostra Jewish syndicate business. According to conference rules, the Jewish delegates could not vote on Cosa Nostra rules, why would they, or policies. However, the Jewish crime bosses were allowed to input on any joint business ventures, clearly, which would included the Flamingo Hotel.
Right.
Damn, that Flamingo Hotel, dude. Failed miserably.
Crazy.
Poor Bugsy.
Well, I mean, what are you going to do? Lucky opened the Havana Conference by discussing a topic, that would greatly affect his authority within the American Mafia. The position of Capo di Tutti Capi, which is boss of all bosses. He didn't like that. The last official boss of all bosses had been Salvatore Maranzano, who was moited in September 1931. Dang, so it's been 15 years since they had an official boss.
Well, no, the boss of all bosses, and then the five families and the commission was formed after that.
By the end of 1931, Luciano had eliminated this top position and reorganized the Italian mafia into the Cosa Nostra, or this thing of ours. This little thing of ours.
This little thing of ours.
A board of directors, commonly called the commission, had been formed to oversee criminal activities. They controlled the rules and also set policies. Cosa Nostra thus became the top criminal organization within the National Crime Syndicate.
Obviously, Lucky could have easily declared himself as Maranzano's heir in 1932 and said he decided to exercise control behind the scenes. This arrangement had worked until Genovese's return from Italy. Officially, Genovese was now just a capo regime. However, he had made it clear that he intended to take control of the Luciano crime family.
Ooh.
Since Luciano's deportation in 1946, Luciano ally Frank Costello had been the acting boss of the family. As a result, tensions between the Costello and Genovese factions had started to fester.
Uh-oh.
Luciano had no intention of stepping down as the family boss, though, and he had to do something about Genovese, too.
Right.
I was like, can't have this guy.
You gotta put your foot down and show who's boss, bud.
Right, literally.
Right. Lucky also realized that Genovese threatened his overall authority and influence within the American Mafia, probably with support from other crime bosses.
Sure.
Therefore, Lucky decided to resurrect the boss of all bosses position and claim it for himself.
Bam.
He hoped for the other bosses would support him, either by officially affirming the title or at least by acknowledging that he was still the first amongst equals. Cool. At the conference, Lucky allegedly presented the motion to retain his position as the top boss in the La Cosa Nostra. Then Luciano ally Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia seconded the motion. Anastasia voted with Lucky because he felt threatened by Genovese's attempt to muscle in on his waterfront rackets. Mm-hmm. He's like, yeah, dude, he's coming in on my waterfront rackets. He's muscling me around.
Well, unfortunately for Genovese, he was checkmated by the Luciano Costello Anastasia alliance, and he was forced to swallow his ambitions and plan for the future. To further embarrass Genovese, Luciano encouraged Anastasia and Genovese to settle their differences and shake hands in front of the other bosses.
You know they didn't like that.
Right.
Man.
This symbolic gesture was meant to prevent another bloody gang war such as the Castellammarese War. With Luciano solidifying his personal position and squashing Genovese's ambition for now, Luciano brought up the discussion of the mob's narcotics operations in the United States. He's like, all right, that's out of the way. Let's sell some drugs, boys.
Right. A long-standing myth has been the supposed refusal of Lucky and Cosa Nostra to deal in narcotics. In reality, only a few bosses such as Frank Costello and the other bosses who controlled lucrative gambling empires opposed narcotics. The anti-drug faction believed that Cosa Nostra did not need narcotics profits, that narcotics brought unwanted law enforcement and media attention, which is true, and that the general public considered it to be very harmful activity, unlike gambling.
It's true.
Also true, right. The pro-drug faction said that narcotics were far more profitable than any other illegal activity, which
Probably
is
true.
Right. Furthermore, if Cosa Nostra ignored the drug trade, other criminal organizations would jump in and eventually diminish Cosa Nostra's power and influence.
Right,
like,
dude. They're making some good arguments here, dude.
Like, dude, we run everything now, and if we don't run this, we will be nothing.
This is the future of America, pretty much.
We will be nothing.
Yeah, well, Luciano himself had long had involvement in the drug trade, starting as a small-time dealer in the late 1910s. 1928, after the murder of Arnold the Big Bankroll Rothstein, Luciano and Louis Lepke Buckhalter took over Rothstein's large drug importation operation. Since the 20s, the mob had been involved in drug importation like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. So cocaine, too, huh? Right. Not very popular, though. Yeah. Obviously into North America. In the 30s, the organization started transporting narcotics from the East Asia Golden Triangle and South America to Cuba and into Florida. Yep. The American mob had a long-time association with the government of Cuba concerning gambling interests such as casinos. Well, we already established that the president was a freaking silent partner. Right. At this time. Right. Along with their legitimate business investments on the Caribbean island as well.
Of course.
Jeez, dude, these guys are everywhere.
Right. Well, this put them in a position to use their political and underworld connections to make Cuba one of their narcotics importation layovers, or smuggling points where the drugs could be stored, obviously. They were then placed on sea vessels before they continued on to Canada and the United States via the Montreal and Florida, among the ports used by Luciano's associates. Where's Montreal? On the east side?
Montreal, Quebec. No, it's like
Oh, it's right up through the...
yeah.
Right, wow. Oh, yeah, go right into New York, Hudson, Lawrence, and go right...
Montreal had a huge ass mafia presence, dude.
Dude, with Luciano's deportation to Italy, he now had the opportunity to import heroin from North Africa via Italy and Cuba into the U.S. and Canada. Oh, dude. Lucky made connections with Sicily's biggest bosses, such as... Oh, look, he did get with the bosses. Such as Don Caligaro Vizzini, they call him Callo. He was from Villalba, who assisted the Allies' invasion of Sicily and had the greatest political connections of all Sicilian bosses. Oh, look at he's
I wonder what the mob was doing in Sicily when they were occupied by Nazis, dude.
Right.
Or not even they weren't occupied by Nazis. They were under Mussolini,
Right,
even worse.
right.
Well, I think Mussolini actually, that's why a lot of them started coming over in the 40s too, or the 20s when Mussolini took over because he like cracked down on them.
Oh, yeah, because he wanted the power.
Right.
Yeah, mobster has no place in...
And communists,
Right.
where they're like control everything.
Right. Also, Don Pasquale Ania, a powerful boss in Palermo, who had connections to legitimate pharmaceutical companies because large-scale heroin manufacturing in Italy was legal at the time. Oh, no shit.
I mean, it's medicine.
Right.
During the Havana Conference, Luciano detailed the proposed drug network to the bosses. After arriving in Cuba from North Africa, the mob would ship the narcotics to the U.S. ports that it controlled, primarily New York, New Orleans, and Tampa. The narcotics shipped to the New York docks would be overseen by the Luciano crime family and the Mangano crime family, who later became the Gambino crime family. In New Orleans, operation would be overseen by the Marcello crime family, led by Carlos Little Man Marcello. Could be Marcello, I don't know. In Tampa, the narcotic shipments would be overseen by the Trafficante crime family, led by Santo Trafficante Jr. The Havana Convention delegates voted to approve the plan.
Of course
They're
they
like,
did.
all in favor? Say, fuck yeah. Fuck yeah.
Well, Lucky built a massive drug organization spanning Italy and America together. One of Luciano's narcotics lieutenants in Sicily was his old associate from New York, Nicola Zuccola Gentile. He oversaw all drug operations in Agrigento province for Lucky, and his partner Don Giuseppe Sedicassi, the capo provincial of Agrigento. Jeez, oh, Pete. A top Lucky lieutenant in the Caniba network of mainland Italy was Antonio Farina, who would ship the narcotics to the United States partners in New York's Mangano crime family, including Albert Anastasia, Frank Scalise, Jack Scarpula, Peter Badilla, and Matty Cuomo. Oh, Cuomo's?
Cumio or Cuomo, right? Wasn't the governor?
Yeah, and
both governors.
the governor and...
The dad of the one was the governor, and then the one governor that just was there.
Cuomo, and his brother was the...
Yeah, the stupid CNN guy,
CNN
Fredo.
guy.
Longtime Luciano ally Frank Fingers Coppola ran the Sicilian Pardonico clan. This was a satellite group affiliated with the Detroit Partnership or the Zerilli crime family, led by boss Joseph Josie Zerilli and fellow bosses and Detroit allies, Papa John Prizziola, Papa John, Angelo Melli, and Raphael Quasarano. The Detroit crime family then shipped the narcotics. Dude, Detroit was big shipping those shit from right there across the river from Canada. Mm-hmm. They then shipped the narcotics to the New York contacts Giovanni Big John Ormento of the Lucchese crime family, Carmine Lilo Galante, and Natale Joe Diamonds Evola of the Bonanno crime family. Also, Frank Cheech Lavorsi of the Luciano crime family, and Joseph Joe Bandy Biondo of the Mangano crime family. These East Coast contacts would then distribute the drugs all along the East Coast.
Holy shit.
Dude, holy shit.
Well, there's more Lucky lieutenants, and they were working mainland Italy, including American deportees, Frank Barone, Giuseppe Arena. He did that in Rome. Frank Perico and Frank Severino and Giovanni Marghieri in Milan. Salvatore Di Bella in Naples, and former Mangano crime family soldier Joseph Joe Peachy.
Right.
He's in Milan and in Genoa. Other U.S. distributions groups that worked with Lucky and his allies were the Belanca Gang, brothers Antonio Joseph and Sebastiano Benny Belanca, and Gaetano Tommy Martino of the Mangano crime family. Then there was the group of Sedimo Big Sam Akari, Joseph Hoboken Joe Stasi, and his brothers James and Anthony, Anthony Granza as well, Vincent Ferrara, and Luis Cirillo, who worked for Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia, and Carl Gambino.
Even with all the growing animosity, Lucky Luciano couldn't leave out his old associate, Don Vito Genovese, who had his group of distributors, including Anthony Strollo, Vincent Morrow, Frank the Bug Caruso, Salvatore Sam Maneri, Vincent Chin Gigante, and even Joseph Joe Cago Valachi. Ooh, the Valachi guy. He's the one that turns on everybody. Who were all associated with the Papalia Aguchi network of the Magadino crime family of Buffalo and led by members Johnny Pops Papalia and Alberto Aguchi of Hamilton and Toronto, Ontario. Look at the Canadians getting involved in this, huh?
At first, the Mafia's operation was one of many individual operations connected or affiliated to the French Corsican mob, or Union Corse's famous French Connection heroin distribution ring. So by the late 1950s, the Sicilians and Americans organized a joint U.S. and Sicilian La Costa Nostra narcotics operation that would eventually grow into one of the largest global narcotics operations ever.
Jeez.
This famous joint U.S. Sicilian operation came to be known as the Pizza Connection.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Right. Pizzagate, baby.
Right.
This was cemented between the two mafia organizations at the famous Mafia Summit held at the Grand Hotel des Palms in Palermo. That was in Sicily.
Salvatore and Ugo Caneba assisted Luciano and were the overseers of the famous heroin operation they controlled from mainland Italy to the U.S. The Caneba network, which supplied high-grade pharmaceutical quality heroin. Wow. Pharmaceutical quality. Luciano's narcotics network was big and complex, and he had many of his old deported former U.S. allies to help him run his empire through the late 40s. The main drug imported by Luciano's network at the time was heroin, and the main sources were French underworld clans that were made up of the core of the Union Corps Syndicate, or the French mob. The French mob, too, huh? What did they do?
What do they do?
Wee wee. Wee wee. Smoking cigarettes.
What do they do? Compliment everybody to death.
They're easy to control because they always surrender. So.
Right.
The Corsican clan was headed by powerful bosses Anton De Gastino, Jean Baptiste Croce, and Paul Mandolini, while the Marseilles clan was made up of 4 groups. Okay, good.
And others.
Oh, there they are.
Well, these 4 powerful groups included brothers Antoine, and Barthélemy. His name was Mimi Guarini. Brothers Dominique and Jean Venturi, brothers Marcel, Xavier, and Jean Francisci, and Joseph Orsini. Auguste Joseph Ricord was another boss that became part of the Union Corps in the 1960s and 70s. These 2 clans ruled the French underworld from the late 1940s all the way through the 60s, supplying Luciano and his mafia allies with large amounts of heroin until the heroin ring known as the French Connection started to crumble in 1972 with the arrest of one of its biggest bosses, Auguste Joseph Ricord. The Luciano narcotics empire continued to grow after that and prosper with the help of the United States associates.
Yeah, many of Luciano's partners within the narcotics empires were Havana Conference delegates such as Joseph the Old Man Profaci, who was once the biggest importer of olive oil and tomato paste in the United States and quietly used his food importation business to smuggle narcotics for decades. Gaetano Tommy Brown Lucchese, a longtime Luciano ally from their days as children in the streets of New York, and who, along with his Lucchese crime family's narcotics distribution arm, the 107th Street Crew, which controlled all heroin distribution in Harlem. So, they're important in New York for him, huh? Without a doubt, one of the architects of the American Heroin Network and a partner of Luciano is well-known and powerful New York Mafia boss Joseph Joe Bananas Bonanno, the patriarch of the Bonanno crime family, who, along with the assistance of his cousin, Buffalo crime family boss Stefano the Undertaker Magadino, led the American Mafia's expansion into Canada.
Damn
Buffalo
right
there, baby.
They're like, we got Canada, guys.
Right.
Bonanno's and Magadino's crime families in New York and Buffalo opened up Montreal and Toronto in the 1950s as satellite groups or individual operations connected with the famous French Connection. But eventually the satellite groups would grow into their own powerful crime families themselves.
Yep.
And they would control massive narcotic distribution centers and still operate even today. Not centers, distribution networks.
Yeah, same thing.
All the narcotics networks mentioned helped destroy the myth that Charlie Lucky Luciano and La Cosa Nostra were against drugs.
Of course.
When the Cuban president Zaldivar was eventually overthrown by Fidel Castro in 1959, and everybody was like, get the hell out of Cuba, the mob had to look elsewhere for a landing and storage facility for their narcotics shipments. Castro was like, I don't think so.
Well, that went in really deep into the drug trade.
Right.
But the next item on the agenda at the Havana Conference was what Lansky called the Siegel situation. In the mid-30s, the New York and Chicago crime families had been sent west to establish and oversee a race wire service, gambling activities in L.A. and Nevada, and supervise narcotic shipments from Mexico.
Right.
In a short while, Bugsy Siegel had become a popular and visible figure in Hollywood's most glamorous circles. Oh, yeah, he knew everybody.
Right.
The Flamingo Hotel was a creation of Billy Wilkerson, a Hollywood nightclub owner and one of the founders of The Hollywood Reporter. Wow. By the mid-40s, it was an unfinished dream deferred. The Flamingo Hotel project became Siegel's obsession. He persuaded his longtime friend and business associate Lansky to help him sell New York and Chicago crime bosses on investing. Yeah, I'm sure they'll mention it, but he kept asking for millions of dollars.
Right.
Yeah, Siegel promised the bosses that the hotel and casino would be smart and profitable investment, but it didn't work out. There was nothing there in Vegas at this time.
But he was going, he had something.
He had celebrities going there, but then, if you remember, I don't know if I'm sure.
There was no strip yet or anything.
There's no strip, but even the hotel, the Flamingo, when the Hollywood guests would come there, half of it was still under construction, and there were sheets and plastic hanging all over the place, and people were like, fuck this place.
Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah. Why in the hell would I want to come here?
Right.
The Flamingo project immediately ran into problems, as we were just saying. Bugsy appointed his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, as a project overseer. As a result, contractors were stealing from Bugsy. They would sell him materials one day and then steal them from the building next. Then resell them to him the very next day after that. Dude, all my shit got stolen.
Wow, this dude's an idiot.
Right. The Flamingo project was also impacted by the rising cost of materials and labor from the post-World War II building boom. Bottom line was that a project costed to about $1.5 million would eventually reach $6 million.
Jeez. To make matters worse, the bosses suspected Siegel and Hill of stealing project money. Lansky and the bosses had discovered that Hill was taking frequent trips to Zurich, Switzerland, and depositing money into a bank account.
Oh, no, dude.
They suspected that Siegel was skimming money and might flee the country if the Flamingo failed.
That's exactly what he was going to do.
Following a discussion, the delegates voted to execute him.
Oh, wow.
The delegates assigned Chicago outfit consigliere Charles Trigger Happy Fischetti, you don't want that guy, to oversee the contract. The actual hit would be given to Jack Dragna, who was part of the L.A. crime family. He was the crime family boss.
Right.
Dragna, who despised Siegel, then gave the contract to mob hitman John Frankie Carbo, who was a Lucchese crime family soldier. Geez, outsourced it like a mother. Huh?
I guess so. At the last moment, though, Bugsy got a reprieve. The partly completed Flamingo was scheduled to open on 26th of December. Longtime Bugsy friend Lansky convinced delegates to see how the hotel did in its opening.
Right, you got to at least give them that.
Right, let's see how it goes. The delegates agreed and then took a break for Christmas Day. The delegates soon learned that the Flamingo opening night was a flop. The enraged mobsters demanded Bugsy's head on a platter. Lansky again convinced them, wait a minute, guys, just let's hold on. Fresh territory over there, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Middle of the freaking desert. He got screwed over by the contractors a million times. Well, he was arguing that Bugsy could still save the casino and we can still make money on this, guys. This is a thing. You know it is. You know gambling is a thing.
Well, unfortunately for Siegel and Lansky, after 2 weeks, the Flamingo closed to resume construction. The completed hotel opened a few months later. The Flamingo started making a small profit, but the mafia investors had finally lost patience with Siegel. June 20th, 1947, Siegel was home alone at Hill's mansion in Los Angeles reading a newspaper by a living room window.
First of all, why is he in L.A. when he should be in Vegas?
Right. Well, a gunman with a military M1 carbine rose up from the bushes and fired 4 shots into the room. Siegel was hit twice in the head and twice in the torso and died instantly. Dang. Not only in the head, shot us right freaking through his eye.
Right. Poor guy.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of this Havana Conference, the tension between Luciano and Genovese allegedly reached a boiling point. According to the Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, which is a book by Martin Gosch and Richard Hammer, meeting with Luciano in his room at the Hotel Nacional, Genovese told him that the United States government knew that Lucky was in Cuba and was pressuring the Cuban government to expel him. Since Lucky was going to have to return to Italy, he should turn over leadership of the Luciano crime family to Genovese and retire. He's like, dude, you just need to do it.
They're going to make you go back to Italy, dude.
Right. Lucky was positive that Genovese had tipped off the United States government in his presence in Cuba, so Lucky finally snapped. He proceeded to beat Genovese and eventually broke 3 of his ribs. It was 3 days before Vito could travel again.
Damn.
He's lucky he didn't kill him.
All right. Well, when Vito felt better, Luciano and Anastasia put him on a plane to the States. Luciano also threatened to kill him if he ever mentioned this incident to anybody.
Oh, wow.
February 1947, the New York papers got wind of the fact that Luciano was in Cuba. U.S. drug agent Harry Anslinger called that son of a bitch Anslinger by Anslinger, not Anslingers, right. Anslinger by Luciano, demanded that Cuba deport Luciano to Italy. Why?
Right.
Anslinger claimed that Luciano was behind the recent surge of heroin into the United States. Wasn't wrong. When Cuba refused to comply, Anslinger took the case to President Harry Truman. And Harry Truman's like, dude, I got to... well, this is already after the bomb, so...
Right.
The U.S. government then halted all shipments of medical supplies to Cuba while Luciano was still on the island. Wow.
Oh, my.
Later in February, the Cubans caved in, they arrested him, and sent him back to Italy. Of course, when his plane landed there, the Italians arrested Luciano, but released him soon after.
Yeah.
And eventually died January 26, 1962, of a heart attack at the Naples, Italy airport while picking up movie producer Martin Gosch.
Oh, that was in a book. It wasn't a movie.
That must have been the movie, yeah.
Okay.
Good for him.
Right. Well, Martin Gosch...
that was a book.
Okay.
That was a screenplay.
Right. Martin Gosch had helped Luciano write an autobiographical screenplay, but the Mafia Commission wouldn't allow the film to be made.
Oh, no shit.
Gosch, along with Richard Hammer, used the screenplay to write the book, The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano.
So it was a book.
Yeah. They did that in 1975. Lucky's longtime associate and eventual nemesis, Vito Genovese, died of a natural death at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1969. Lucky and Genovese, they're both buried 100 feet from each other in the same cemetery in New York.
Which is crazy. I don't know why they would allow them to come back, to New York to be buried.
Right.
Well, Luciano knew that Vito had tipped off the U.S. government to his whereabouts in Cuba. He did not live to learn that it was actually Joe Bananas who revealed to New York City's newspapers as to Luciano's whereabouts in Cuba in February of 1947. Joseph Bonanno was a respected and feared Don who was ruthless, ambitious, and had aspired to be crowned boss of all bosses like his former boss and mentor, Salvatore Maranzano. This information of Bonanno's treachery was picked up by former FBI agent William Romer, who was given the information by several of his former FBI colleagues. Romer details this on pages 132 to 42 in his 1990 book, The War of the Godfathers. The film The Godfather Part 2 was an homage to the Havana Conference when Michael Corleone travels to Havana to have a meeting with several other mob bosses. The film Bugsy also had the climatic debate and decision on whether to and when to execute Bugsy, set at the Hotel Nacional. Yeah, that's going to do it for these two major conferences. Plus, a lot of these episodes, you guys are going to hear some of the same stuff because, I mean, obviously some of this stuff's intertwined. So.
Right.
And obviously, we're going to leave it in there because some people might not listen to the other episodes. They might tune in for one of these. So some stuff's going to be repeated, and obviously that's the way it's going to be. But it was pretty nice.
Yeah.
The Atlantic City Conference, the Havana Conference.
Right.
All major little things going on here. And this will be leading us into the Genovese crime family, which will start next week with the profile of old Frankie Costello.
Oh, Frankie Costello.
And major highlight of that will be his rivalry with Genovese. So, and those two are struggling for power. So we will see that next week. In the meantime, go check out Battles of the American Civil War, where this week we are covering the one, the only, the most famous battle in American history, probably, the old Gettysburg battle. Finally reached that, and the old turning point of the war, people say. Some people say. I don't say it. Some people say it. Gettysburg, that's going to be a long one. Probably like 2 hours of that, too. So maybe we'll cut it in two. I don't know. But Battles of the American Civil War, wherever you get your podcasts. And stay tuned. We're coming up soon. Within the next couple of weeks, probably we'll announce our new show that we're going to do. And I think it's going to be revolutionary. It'll change the world. Some people say. Some people say. But we'll see that in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, we'll be back next week for Frank Costello and the start of the profile of the Genovese crime family. We got a long ways to go in this mafia world, and shit's only going to get crazier because those 70s mafia is crazy, dude.
You ain't kidding.
We'll see you next week for Frank Costello. We are the Monthly Michiganders.
Dang.